Disclaimer. My work draws heavily upon the works of Carlos Castaneda. While there are few direct quotes, the underlying concepts are drawn from his work. My interpretations of those works are provided to advance my own point of view and in no way constitute a claim to anything that was not created by me. I have no commercial interest in this work. It is provided free for those who might find value in it. I have no connection with Castaneda's estate, nor with any entity, commercial or otherwise, that claims to be connected with Castaneda or with anyone connected to him. I express no opinion on the claims of those who purport to be connected with Castaneda, in the present or in the past.
Lastly, this work should not be construed as in any way condoning, supporting, encouraging, or recommending the use of any dangerous or illegal substance, or the performing of any dangerous or illegal activities. The teaching and research methods depicted in Castaneda's works should be viewed as the result of a unique convergence of time, place, and circumstance, and not as a template that any other person should attempt to follow.
Concerning the use of various terms. Throughout this work, certain terms are used which are defined in the anthropological literature. My use of these terms is limited only to those meanings that were given to them by Don Juan in his explanations for Castaneda. Terms such as tonal, nagual, etc., are used as Don Juan defined them, and in no other sense. I place no value judgment on the existing definitions of terms, they are simply not relevant to this work.
Chapter 6, Part 2. Don Juan could see in Castaneda's luminous body what the major weaknesses in Castaneda's tonal were. But assuming that Castaneda's self-portrayal is even remotely accurate, one doesn't need to be a sorcerer to diagnose these flaws, namely, self-importance and its adjunct, self-pity. Many of us feel as though we are destined for great things. We may often feel even that we are entitled on some level to these great things, but with no idea how or why any of these great things will happen. After a time when the expected future doesn't come to pass, we can become resentful of anything and everything, that due to factors completely outside our control our greatness has been thwarted. We are thus miserable with no concrete reason for our misery, no real target for the frustration and rage inside us. As a result we turn these feelings inward and become self-pitying, while at the same time never examining the feelings of self-importance that began the cycle. That sums up Castaneda in 1960. While he was still young at the time, and hadn't at all given up on the great things happening, his sense of self-pity about his upbringing, his situation, etc., was already quite strong. 1. Losing self-importance. On one of their long hikes into the desert, Don Juan told Castaneda that he should talk to a plant. Castaneda protested, for no real reason other than that he didn't want to do it and would feel stupid talking to a plant. Don Juan urged him on, pointing out that they were quite literally in the middle of nowhere, there was no one to hear Castaneda making a fool of himself. Attempting to play the reason card, Castaneda asked what the point was, what good it would do, etc. As always, Don Juan replied with the truth, even if Castaneda wasn't capable of processing the truth at the time. Don Juan replied that Castaneda should do it to show him and himself that he and the little plant are the same. Don Juan said that since both were luminous beings, both were, in the most important sense, equal. He told Castaneda that if he wanted to learn about plants, as he claimed, then the first step in learning is to embrace the truth that he was no better than the plant. Desperate not to go through with it, Castaneda asked lamely what he should say to the plant. Don Juan replied that the words didn't matter, he could say anything, or even make up nonsense sounds. The important thing in this exercise was to address the fundamental concept that he and the plant were equal. And, left unsaid was the idea that if Castaneda could embrace being equal to a tiny plant, then how could he sustain his sense of self-importance? Castaneda actually tried to talk to a plant, sort of. But he couldn't, not even in the desert far from any other person besides Don Juan. Don Juan acted disgusted and changed the subject as he started walking again. This story gives an idea of how deeply ingrained the sense of self-importance was in Castaneda, and how he would employ his wits to any degree to avoid doing something that he considered beneath him, or humiliating.
This ending, where Don Juan gives up in seeming disgust after Castaneda fails yet again, is very common. This is partially genuine frustration, but mostly a motivational technique on Don Juan's part. Castaneda was very intelligent, an academic. Getting the right answer was important to him. To be dismissed by an old Indian man, especially in such a seemingly trivial assignment, was like a failing grade. It motivated him to do better the next time, and it tweaked his self-importance, showing him, eventually, how childish his efforts to avoid the challenge had been. Don Juan continually hammered on Castaneda's self-importance, knowing that it, and the self-pity it engendered, were the major stumbling blocks to real learning for Castaneda. One of the most common devices Don Juan used, both in normal awareness and in left-side or heightened awareness, was to subject Castaneda to embarrassing situations. One reason he did so was that it was incredibly easy to do. Castaneda's self-importance meant that any situation in which he was put in contact with people or situations unfamiliar to him, and in some way, beneath him, was humiliating in the extreme. Afterwards, the reaction and the self-importance that fueled it could be discussed as a learning experience. Another reason is that embarrassment, in Don Juan's parlance, shrinks the tonal. The tonal is by nature shy. The unfamiliar and off-putting make it instantly shrink back a little, making greater learning possible without jeopardizing the student. Self-importance is perhaps the single greatest example in support of the idea, expressed above, that as opposed to actual change, there is a reordering of priorities. Changing facades is how Don Juan referred to this phenomenon. Self-importance could not be eradicated in Castaneda, and we wouldn't wish it to be, in him, or in any other person. A certain degree of self-importance is necessary for survival. So while the teacher's job in this case was to hammer the student's self-importance relentlessly in order to bring it down to a level where it befits an Agwell, he cannot eradicate it entirely. A certain amount of self-importance is needed for self-preservation, and one who would be the leader of a group of sorcerers must be able to express confidence and authority. 2.1. Using death as an advisor. Self-importance, unchecked, leads to one of two outcomes in a person, depending upon the course of his or her life. If the person meets or exceeds the expectations set out for them, by themselves or by others, those people tend to be admired in society. They're considered high achievers, and often they end up being famous in whatever field they've gravitated to.
If the person falls short of those expectations, as discussed above, he or she tends to become bitter, cynical, and self-pitying. The desire for great things is undiminished, but the person has fallen short, through, in his or her mind, no fault of his or her own. Over time, self-pity becomes one's reliable companion and advisor, the one thing that can always be relied upon. Since it is the result of disappointment, it can never in and of itself disappoint.
Since self-pity is not in and of itself a behavior but the result of other behaviors, it can't be directly addressed. This presented a teaching challenge for Don Juan. What Don Juan did first was to point out the extent to which self-pity permeated Castaneda's being. This wasn't easy to do, but it created many tense moments, not surprisingly. Also not surprisingly, Castaneda resisted this notion, so it took many instances of Don Juan pointing out examples of Castaneda's self-pitying nature for Castaneda to grudgingly accept that self-pity was a large part of his personality and needed to be eradicated. A note about how these personality-changing lessons were delivered. For his part, Don Juan made sure that his criticisms of Castaneda, as damning and brutal as they might be, were always concise, direct, and specific.
Thus, when Castaneda reacted badly, as we more or less all would, there was nothing for Don Juan to do but wait until things had calmed down a little, and then discuss the issue again, with the emotion largely removed. Thus Don Juan never had to take anything back, or explain what he'd meant, etc. The message remained consistent. If the lesson did not get through, it would be addressed again, at another time, and again, if necessary, until the message finally and firmly took hold. The ability of Don Juan to maintain an unwavering position and his willingness to explain a point 100 different ways, if necessary, were, in the case of some lessons, the only reasons said lessons ever got learned. The second aspect of addressing self-pity was to suggest to Castaneda that there was a better way, i.e., a much better entity to be witness to all of Castaneda's thoughts and actions, a much more reliable and sober advisor than self-pity. Don Juan suggested that the cure for self-pity was to use death as an advisor. He described death as a shadow that walks alongside us, to our left, at every moment. At the appropriate time, death taps us on the shoulder, and our time on earth is up. Castaneda knew that Don Juan was speaking metaphorically, but the idea unnerved him. Still, to drive home his point, Don Juan told Castaneda that, if he was quick enough, he might be able to catch a glimpse of his death. As they walked along in a dry riverbed, Don Juan told Castaneda to, on his word, quickly turn left. At a certain moment the command was given and Castaneda complied, and describes the chilling feeling of seeing a fleeting shadow for a fraction of a second when he turned. Don Juan did it again, with the same scary results. How he did this, a trick of the light, an accomplice, etc., isn't important. See footnote 1, at the end of the main narration, the visual effect was merely to drive home the point of the lesson. And while his description of death as a shadow that walks to our left was metaphorical, the ability to use death as an advisor was the most expedient way Don Juan had to help Castaneda lower the importance of self-pity in his life and thinking. He put it to Castaneda in the following way, paraphrased: when you are upset, or sad, turn to your left and ask your death if it is time. He will answer that no, it isn't your time yet. Knowing that, you can move forward. Death is the only advisor worth listening to. While the above is more or less the same as the well-known and well-worn advice to live each day as if it's your last, the lesson has considerably more impact in the setting and context in which it took place, especially juxtaposed with having seen death itself just minutes before.
Footnote 1. While trickery is an essential part of the sorcery teaching process, there is no suggestion that anything Don Juan ever presented to Castaneda was anything other than completely real, that is, produced by natural means and perceivable with unaided senses. The suggestion that the shadow on the rock was produced with the help of an accomplice is for dramatic purposes only, to emphasize the point that the actual means were not important, especially in this case because Don Juan was describing something that can't be seen in a way to help Castaneda visualize his meaning. At various other times throughout the course of their association, Don Juan described death in various other ways, for the same reason as in this case, to put words to something that can't be readily described.